Okay, so welcome to today's Salesforce Developer webinar. And in this session, we're going to be looking at a new feature in Summer 15, user provisioning for connected apps. So I'm Pat Patterson. I'm a developer evangelist. It says architect on the slide, but never mind. At Salesforce, I work on the Salesforce platform. And I'm joined today by Vikas Jain, who's one of our product management directors. Vikas, why don't you explain your role in that organization?
So I'm Director of Product Management for Salesforce Identity, part of the Salesforce Platform Group. And I have more than 15 years of experience in the identity management.
Okay. And in fact, before Salesforce, I spent almost a decade at Sun Microsystems, where I was working on single sign-on and web access control on the open source OpenSSO project. So I go back with Vikas on this quite a way as well. So if you've ever dialed into one of our webinars before, you will recognize the safe harbor statement. Please do not make any purchasing decisions for stock or products based on the content of this webinar. We may well make forward-looking statements. Please use the investor section of our website. And we're a very social bunch at Salesforce. Our developer relations team is present on all of these channels across Twitter, Facebook, and so on. You can search for us as Salesforce developers on your social network of choice. And you can tweet at us with either the Salesforce devs Twitter handle or the Force Webinar hashtag. And just to head off, possibly the most frequently asked question, we do record all webinars and we'll post this to YouTube in just a few days. So, over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to take a look at what we actually mean by user provisioning. Vikas is going to explain some of the benefits you can expect from this technology and then give us a demo of it in action. We'll take a look at what's happening under the covers, and then I'll cover some of the standards that are involved and look at exactly what's going along the wire as we provision users from Salesforce into other providers. So, Vikas, user provisioning, what do we actually mean here?
So user provisioning is a way to manage the user lifecycle from hire to retire. So when a user gets created in a system, they get access to different accounts. Their information gets updated when they are with the company, such as moving to another role. And finally, when they are terminated, then taking away access from all the applications. Now, as you can use this feature to create, update, delete accounts and other applications, you can also use it with other Salesforce organizations because that can be treated as other applications.
So these cases aren't mutually exclusive, are they? We might have customers who have multiple orgs plus Google and Box, and user provisioning can be working across, quite a mixed environment here.
Now, if you already have other user repositories as your source of truth, for example, some of you might have Active Directory where all the user identities reside, you can use a product from Salesforce called Identity Connect to bridge the Active Directory with Salesforce, get the users provisioned from Active Directory into Salesforce, and then further into other applications through the user provisioning feature in Salesforce. Similarly, you can take the feed from Workday as your HR application and create the users automatically into Salesforce using a connector developed by Workday.
So let me get this straight. If Workday is my system of record for employees, that's where I'm looking at my source of truth. Creating an employee record in Workday can feed into Salesforce, and then it might feed to multiple other service provider applications and automatically create a whole bunch of accounts.
That's right. So let's quickly look at some of the benefits of using this feature. For the employees, that brings enhanced security, as when a user is terminated, their accounts across all the different applications are disabled immediately, instead of waiting for days for an administrator or a business owner of the application to disable them. And that's more important these days, where you have native mobile applications connecting to these service providers using OAuth token, which are long-lived tokens. And even though their AD account is disabled, users can continue to use their mobile applications for these service providers if their account in these service providers are not disabled. Also, you can get a report on who has what account in what application. That could be used for your audit and compliance reasons. And finally, you need less people to manage the user lifecycle in these applications, as these operations can be automated with this feature.
So, and I think it's interesting and very telling that security is far higher up the list than productivity. We could tolerate maybe a few minutes or even a few hours for new employees' accounts to be created, but when they leave, we really want those accounts to be shut down in seconds.
That's correct. And as we hear all the different breaches happening, it's very important that the user termination is top of your list. The other benefit the customers and partners can use cases can have with this feature. So for example, if you are running a B2C website and you want your users to be onboarded into your multiple web properties, then you can use this feature to automatically create the user account in those properties. And when I say web properties, it could be web applications or your in-house built applications.
So that might be something like some customer self-service application. It might be a wiki. It might be some
billing
communities
application.
portal billing. Okay, so whichever web applications your customers are using, you can essentially tie these together.
Correct. Now, often customers might update the information. They might change their last name when people get married, or they might change their email address. And when they do it, you want that information to be synchronized across all the different web applications. And again, this feature can help you with that. So your customers don't have to change it at various places. Also, for the partner use cases, often the partners might request for access to additional applications, and using the workflow from Salesforce, you can have an approval process tied in so that the partners can request for additional access to the applications. Finally, if you are an ISV, you can use this feature to and if you have an application that's not running on the platform, you would need a separate account for the user to be created in that application. Now, with this feature, as users are installing your application through appexchange.com, then you can automatically create the users in your applications that's not running on the platform and have the faster time to set up. Also, you can automate the single sign-on user linking, where such attributes such as federation identifier in Salesforce user record needs to be populated with whatever ID was created on your target application. So this reduces the administrative work that's required on customer's side when using your application. And finally, this is packageable, so you can package this feature with your other Force.com application features that you are building.
So this essentially adds up to a much more seamless user experience for users working or users installing ISV applications that run kind of off-platform.
That's right. Okay, let's now look at a quick demo of this feature to see it in action. So I have the first thing is this feature is tied with connected app, which describes metadata for any application that's outside of Salesforce. So I created a connected app called Google Apps, and here on the edit button, you will see that when I edit this connected app, there's a checkbox called enable user provisioning. So as soon as I enable this, then I would see additional sections that open up. For example, these two sections get enabled. Now, in order to, let's take this case of Sarah Lee joined the company and she needs to have a new account created. So the Active Directory administrator goes into the Active Directory console and would be creating an account. So I'm logging into the Active Directory here, and here I'm going to create a new user. So let's call her Sarah Lee, and we give her a logon name and a password. And for now, we'll say that password does not expire.
Don't do this in production.
That's right. And here, we are going to edit the password. So let's make sure that I give the email address, not the password. So I'm giving, oops. All right. So I gave the email address that matches my Google domain name and hit OK. Now, let's see if this user got created in Salesforce. So I'm going to go to Manage Users. And okay, well, we see Sarah Lee created in Salesforce. So now I'm going to log in as Sarah Lee. I'm on a different browser now. And Sarah Lee goes into the Salesforce org to the My Domain, and she gets redirected into Identity Connect.
Okay, so this isn't the standard Salesforce login here, where Sarah's actually using her Active Directory credentials?
Yes, so Sarah is only given her Active Directory credentials. On day one, she logs in into Salesforce using those credentials through Identity Connect, and what she sees is she's already having access into Google Apps. When she clicks on it, she's taken into Google Apps. Welcome to the new account. She accepts it, and now she can start emailing. So Sarah can be right now immediately productive as soon as she logged in.
So we created that Active Directory account about, what, 60, 90 seconds ago, and Sarah's already able to log in and not only use Salesforce, but also use Google Apps.
Yeah. Now let's look at Sarah needs access to Box. So Salesforce administrator here comes and assigns a permission set to Box. So there's a permission set called Box users, and as soon as I assign this permission set, this assignment of permission set can be compared to assigning a role to Sarah.
Right, or even adding Sarah to a group in a system like Active Directory, that kind of idea.
Now, as this Sarah got added into Box, a Box account was created by user provisioning feature, and Sarah got this email in her email account saying your Box account is ready, and she clicks on it and can now enter, set a password for Box, and voila, she is now in Box. So So immediately what you saw is Sarah was able to get provision into Google Apps, into Box, and this can be applied to any application that you have.
Very nice.
Now let's look at how this was set up. So as I mentioned, this is done through connected apps. We'll look into the Google Apps configuration for connected app. Here, we use the user provisioning wizard, where first thing you have to do is create a flow. So we created a visual workflow to for our Google Apps and are using a name credential, and we'll go into details on what that flow looks like. The next step of this configuration is to see if any approvals are required or not. Right now, in this automated user provisioning, I'm bypassing the approvals. The third thing you have to select is for what operations you want this feature to be used. So for example, some customers might say, I still want to use a manual process for create user, but I want to use this feature for only the delete. So in that case, you just have one checkbox. Or some customers might say, well, I want to automate the create and disable operation as well as an update operation. And whenever update to things like email address happens, then I want the email address to be automatically populated on the other side. Okay, now as part of the this feature, you can not only just create and update and delete users, you can also collect user account information centrally within Salesforce and run reports on it. For example, here I can click this button and it found 3 accounts in Google Apps. And then the next thing I do is I try to find what is the linking attribute between the two systems. For example, the user records email address on Salesforce. I'm trying to match with Google's email address.
Okay, so we're just correlating the users between the two systems based on that email address.
Correct, and it could be user ID or other attribute, but here we know that email address is the right thing for Google Apps to match. Now, with this linking information rule, I'm trying to analyze the collected users, the 3 users that I collected from Google, and I see that 2 of them were matching in Salesforce and 1 is an orphan, which is only existing in Google but not in Salesforce. So the Google administrator must have created that directly. Now, if I commit this information, after that, this information gets stored in what we call as user provisioning account object on Salesforce. And you can get this information, the user accounts over here as part of the Google, as part of the connected app, as well as you can also view that on the user record. So for example, if I look at the Sarah Lee record at the bottom, I see her user provisioning accounts in both Google Apps and Box.
Oh, very cool. So you can get a handle on exactly not only which accounts your Salesforce users have elsewhere, but also any admin accounts or maybe accounts that were accidentally created in those target systems that have no correlation back to the org.
That's correct. And we also have information about what the user ID, the unique user ID, how that user is identified in the third-party system. So you get reporting on that. Now, if I have to run a report, I can create a report on it. Let's look at a report on all the different requests that were made and what the status of that were. So for example, I just ran a collect operation and it would give me the details. So I can sort this by the latest. And here I went into the Google Apps and collected the users. I created an account in Box. I created an account in Google Apps for Sarah Lee. All these requests are reported, their status are reported, and you can get further details. You can also look into, for your troubleshooting, there is a user provisioning log that gets into details of what happened when it was trying to provision the system, what the request and response values were for the API calls that were made.
So you get right, I can see there, you get right down into the response from Google. And so this is just invaluable stuff for troubleshooting these kind of integrations.
Yes. Now let's look at how the flow looks like. So I'm going to open up the flow here. So here I created a Google Apps flow that, as it opens up, we'll see it's very simple. There's a decision on the type of operation that I'm trying to do, whether it's create or delete or collect. And based on that, I am using an Apex plugin to make the API call and parse the response. So those plugins are available on the left-hand palette. So you can drag and drop those and assign some values. For example, there are input and output parameters that I'm passing to this plugin from the flow, and that's how our engine that calls the flow get handoff of the output that comes back from Google.
So a couple of questions here. One is, how would customers get hold of those Apex plugins? Is that code they'll have to write themselves, or how does that work?
So for some of the top applications, like, for example, Google Apps, Concur, Box, Workday, we are going to create these plugins and flows and put them up as a package on AppExchange so anyone can download and start using it. But if you have a custom application, or if you have an application that's not part of that package, we have detailed help note that you can use to create your own plugin and flow.
Okay, some sample code there and everything you need to build your own plugins. And this is a very basic flow, just basically making a decision on an operation. But you could have any amount of complexity here. You might be looking up records in your org and following some business process to decide whether or not to create that account at that service provider, right?
Correct. And one of the customers that plan to use this feature was asking, can I look up outside of the platform some information that I want to use within my Apex plugin? And the answer is yes. This provides you the ultimate flexibility on the platform on how you want to look up information inside the platform, outside the platform, to create your request.
Awesome. And now I noticed as we were going through there was a named credential in there. Can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so named credential is a very cool feature where instead of hard coding the credentials that you want to use to make API calls, you can define the credentials through named credential and let the code not have to worry about what those values are.
So by credential, we mean like username and password, for example.
So it depends on the type of application. In the case of Google Apps, you cannot really pass username and password in the API call. You need to pass an OAuth token. So name credential support OAuth 2.0 as well as password authentication. If you use password authentication, then you can set the username and password here. And if you use OAuth 2.0, then you can use the auth provider that's created in Salesforce and then run the start authentication flow on save that will go through the OAuth flow and store the token for you so that the token can be referenced from your Apex plugin indirectly.
Got it. And that just keeps all of those credentials, those tokens, those usernames, those passwords out of code and makes them part of configuration where they belong.
Yes, and that also helps you with dev testing, migrating to production, because you can just change your credentials a name credential without having to worry about changing the code. So let's look at quickly on how this works. This feature uses 4 standard objects. The main one is the user provisioning request. You saw the report that I ran on the user provisioning request that told which operations were successful for what application and which operations were not. User prov account is the next one, which stores the shadow account information of all the connected apps that are using the user provisioning feature. So you can run a central report on all the accounts.
So when we scroll down on that user detail page, that's essentially what we were seeing listed at the bottom there was 2 user prov account records. They were just surfaced in the UI as those external accounts, right?
Yes. User prov account staging is a temporary object that's just used by the collection process, so you don't have to worry about it much. User provisioning log is again API enabled object that you can use for your troubleshooting. You can directly write into this object from your Apex classes for your debug messages. Now, the way runtime works is you have a bunch of events that create the user provisioning request. The events could be create, update, delete of users. It could be assigning or unassignment of a user to a profile or a permission set, or because user provisioning request is API enabled, you can directly create a new UPR record from your code.
So you just in the Apex code, just say new UPR record, fill out the fields, insert it, and then that'll kick the process off?
Correct. Now, once a user provisioning request is created, the user provisioning platform kicks in. It processes this UPR by calling the flow that is configured, and then the flow responds. The flow in turn calls the third-party application and sends back a response back to the user provisioning platform, which parses it and get the user into the user provisioning account for create operation, let's say. Now, creating an Apex plugin, you can directly use the process.plugin, but we also have a class that you can extend directly that provides you with a bunch of different input-output parameters into the plugin, so you don't have to worry about it. It basically has 2 methods, the build describe call and the invoke call, very similar to the process.plugin interface. The build describe call is used to describe the input-output parameters, and the invoke is where you process the request and response.
So very, very similar, very familiar for anybody who's done any kind of work with workflow, visual workflow.
Yes. Now, the flow, as you saw, was of a new type called user provisioning flow, and you need to create the flow of this type for it to appear on the wizard, because we filter out the flows that we show on that wizard. Okay, so now let's look at what are the different standards that are used in the user provisioning area.
Yeah, and this is a great example of how the use of standards enables a whole wide range of functionality. Now, the key standard here is called SCIM. Now, SCIM originally stood for Simple Cloud Identity Management, and a very kind of self-descriptive title. We're managing identities across different cloud providers, doing that create, read, update, delete. Along its evolution, I guess the standards people realized that it was more widely applicable than the cloud. Maybe that term was a little misleading. They really liked that SCIM acronym, so they recast it as System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. Not quite as catchy, but I guess it still says SCIM in there. Everything you want to know about SCIM is at the simplecloud.info website. SCIM was released gosh, nearly 4 years ago as 1.0. It was quickly followed by a kind of an evolution, a slipstream release of 1.1. And that's the version that most vendors have implemented now. And as we'll see in a few slides, it's been very, very widely implemented. And it's SCIM is actually at IETF, the standards body, where they're working on nailing down SCIM version 2.0. I don't think there are many functional changes there. It's mainly a case of removing ambiguities and further standardizing the work that's gone on. So the core use cases is kind of fairly unsurprising. It's that provisioning and often more important deprovisioning user accounts, updating attributes, synchronizing accounts across services, and managing group memberships. Now, it's kind of important to recognize that these operations have been available for many years on most cloud providers, Salesforce included, but each of those providers has had their own API, their own mechanism for doing so. What SCIM brings along is a standard API, a standard protocol, a standard set of objects passed back and forth to achieve these operations. And at its root, SCIM is a modern REST protocol. So that means that we're passing data back and forth over HTTP using those familiar HTTP operations. So we might use GET to retrieve a user record and POST to create one. SCIM recommends OAuth for authentication and authorization. So for the most part, SCIM calls will be accompanied by an OAuth token as an HTTP header, which is great because Salesforce speaks OAuth very, very well. We create, modify, retrieve, and discover users and groups, again via those HTML operations. SCIM brings a common user schema that is also extensible. And this is really important. The SCIM core schema contains all of those fields that are pretty much common to every service provider. So user records are going to have a name, they're going to have a username, a set of email addresses, and so on. SCIM also allows extensibility. So there's an enterprise extension that has fields that are more oriented towards employees, so employee number, department, and so on. Now further, as most people on this call will probably recognize very well, we can extend the schema in our Salesforce environments. So we actually build a Salesforce org extension for every Salesforce environment, for every org. And we'll see this in some of the examples in a minute or two. We actually create this URI that ends in that org ID to identify those in the SCIM messages. So those cover any custom fields that you might add to users, so they can still be passed around using SCIM. So with that, let's have a little look at SCIM in action and see some messages on the wire. So let's just go to, oh, I'm here. Okay, so I'm at the command line here, and if I get my script up, I've got a whole bunch of example operations. And just for absolute clarity, I'm just going to do these from the command line with curl. So curl is a great tool for manipulating HTTP. So to start with, what I did was I listed all the users. So what I'm doing is I'm passing that header. I've set up my access token as an environment variable already, so I don't have to share it with the audience. And I'm using the users endpoint. So here we've got the instance URL, so that's going to be something like na15.salesforce.com/services/SCIM/b1/users. So if I just do a get on that users endpoint, I get the list of users. I'm piping it through this little bit of Python here that just formats it nicely as JSON. And I get JSON in response with an array with an entry for each user record. And these are very basic information here. I get a user ID, very familiar Salesforce format here. I get a little bit of metadata on when it was created and so on. And I get some schema information that tells the client how to interpret the data that's come back. So we can see that there's 7 users in this org. Let's move on to something a bit more interesting. Let's get some more information and filter it down a little bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to that user's endpoint, but now I'm saying that I want the username attribute and I want to filter for just usernames containing the string Adam. So here's our response. I get the username and I get a single record because there's only one Adam in my org. All right, let's see how much we can find out about Adam. So what I've done is the next call uses that user ID and appends that to the user's endpoint. So this is how we get a single record back, and this is everything that Salesforce is going to tell us about Adam. So if we scroll down, we can see his display name, we can see emails, he's not in any groups right now, we can scroll down, and here we see that org extension. So this is organization-specific data, and in fact, I've got a custom field here that tells me that Adam's favorite color is, in fact, green. And as well, I've got this enterprise information with his employee number, and in a kind of a strange reversal of fortune that I've become Adam's manager. Okay, so that's playing around with users, accessing users, discovering them, and so on. Let's move on to what Skim calls entitlements. So entitlements, as the name implies, tells us what a user is able to do, like what they're entitled to access. And here, what I'm doing is I'm querying the entitlements endpoint, and I'm looking for an entitlement called hard delete. Okay, I created this in Salesforce terms. This is a permission set. I created a permission set to allow users to have access to the hard delete API, to be able to delete records without them going into the recycle bin, a fairly tightly controlled operation. So there's my permission set, there's its ID and its name and so on. Let's go to that in the browser. I think I've already got this open somewhere here. And we can see, in fact, that there are no users right now with that hard delete permission. Okay, so let's change that by assigning it to the user. So let's give Adam the ability to do a hard delete. So what we actually do here is we do a post. So we post to the endpoint for that entitlement. So again, entitlements endpoint with the ID for the permission set just appended onto the end. We actually use a patch operation. So patch is actually an HTTP verb that means leave the existing data in place, but add in what I'm telling you. And I'm actually passing a little bit of JSON. So let's go and have a look at that. So what I'm saying is, for this entitlement, make this change. Add a member, and he's going to have this value. So this is the user ID. This is the ID of the user that I want to assign to that permission set. So with that, it's just a case of hitting return, and this actually returns me the new state of that permission set. And I can see here from the API that the hard delete permission set now has a single member who is Adam Seligman. So Let's just verify that in the UI here. Unsurprisingly, there's Adam listed as having that hard delete permission. So we get the ability here to manipulate all of this user-related data, users, permission set membership, public group membership via the API in a very standard way. So if you were to write a client that used the SCIM protocol, you could use it with Salesforce, and you could also use it with a wide variety of other providers. And just to look at that variety, I think over the past 2 or 3 years, SCIM has become the, I guess, the identity lingua franca, the common language across products. So you can see here from the huge vendors like CA and IBM, really down to through the kind of the mid-market, mid-range, and down into open source projects. SCIM is pretty ubiquitous for creating, updating, synchronizing users and groups across products.
And Salesforce contributed as one of the authors of the SCIM standards, so we are at the forefront of standards. Now, Pat, if different service providers implemented SCIM standard, probably we need to just create one connector that rules them all?
Yeah, that's exactly the purpose here, that ISVs need to create a single code base, and that should work with any of these systems. And in fact, I guess that shines through in the connectors that we're building. One of them will be a SCIM connector.
Yes, our own implementation for Salesforce will be based on the SCIM connector.
All right. So as we kind of get to the end of this webinar, I'd like to tell you about an upcoming webinar. In a week's time, we'll have 10 principles of Apex testing with CodeFryer. In fact, Kevin Porman. It's funny, I think about community members' Twitter handles first, and then their real name kind of comes to me. That'll be a great event, so definitely, unless you're listening to the replay, it's probably already happened, but register for 10 principles of Apex testing. Before we get to questions, one thing I do want to draw your attention to, if you haven't already done so, a great way to discover and learn the Salesforce platform is Trailhead. So Trailhead is an innovative approach to self-study. If you've used systems like code.org or Code Academy, it's very similar to that. You get to learn about Salesforce and actually perform hands-on challenges, and the system will score you as you go along. You create custom objects, custom fields, and the system verifies, the Trailhead system verifies that you create them correctly and scores you with points and badges. And it's a great fun way to get up to speed with Salesforce. And in the pipeline, I think in the next few months, we will actually be building, we actually have started building an identity set of modules for Trailhead. So definitely keep an eye out there, and go try out a module on Trailhead if you haven't already done so. So with that, let's look at Q&A. And one that I noticed a few times was we were saying delete users, and we were kind of talking in very loose terms, weren't we? Because you can't actually delete a user record in Salesforce.
Correct. So delete was used in the context of a generic operation. How that is interpreted by an application, for example, Salesforce interprets delete as a deactivate. Some application vendors might actually interpret as hard delete. So it is implementation dependent.
Right, but in protocol terms, we talk about delete, and it's down to the provider to decide how that's going to be done.
Correct.
Right. Okay, so what else have we had coming in over the wire?
So how often does the syncing of Salesforce user accounts take place with the third-party apps like Google Apps? Is it real time? Um, all the operations that we were talking about, create, update, delete, is real time. The collect operation, you can decide how often you want it to be collected. There are a couple of ways you can do it. You can go through the console every now and then and collect the users, or you can write a scheduled job, batch job that can run every day to collect the users and sync it with Salesforce.
So you might want to do that if just to check whether any accounts have been created kind of manually in that third-party system, and just keep track of anything that's not reconciled as you would expect.
Yeah, while your business process would say always go to Salesforce or Active Directory to create an account in Google, but if, for example, a Google administrator goes and creates an account directly, then you may want to reconcile it using this collect operation.
Right, just like we deactivated that user directly in Salesforce rather than going to Active Directory just for speed. And those create, updates, and deletes, we've effectively got triggers on the user object that we're detecting those as they happen and then reaching out into the third-party system.
Right. So another question came in. What is the difference between the functionality provided by Okta and this user provisioning feature from Salesforce? So at the very, very high level, it's the same feature set as the Okta's user provisioning, but because this feature is backed and integrated with the Salesforce platform, you have the capability to integrate with things like approval process. You have the customization flexibility to do whatever you want to do in a flow. You're not constrained to a set of, this is how the user will be provisioned, and it's a closed box. With Salesforce, it's an open box. You can customize it.
So you can write those Apex plugins and go nuts, call any API you like.
Yeah, or in your flow, have a very complex flow based on your business process, which can have multiple conditions in it.
Okay.
Okay. Another one is, so there were some errors that happened during the demo. Are these automatically get into the report? Yes. So all the errors that are captured by the user provisioning platform get into the user provisioning log object that you can report on. Additionally, there are Apex methods. This user provisioning log is API exposed. So in your plugin, you can directly call and add new logs to it for your the issues that you encounter. For example, if you get a particular response that you're not expecting back, then you can log that into your log.
Oh, very cool.
Okay. So can I add Salesforce users to Google Group automatically once that user get created with Gmail account? Yes, because it is leveraging whatever APIs are being exposed by Google or any third-party application. So Google has an API where you can assign the user to a particular Google group. In your Apex plugin, apart from creating a user, you can also assign them to the groups. This is also useful where in the identity world, what they call as birthright entitlements. So as you create a user, you want to have certain roles, groups, entitlements assigned. You can again do that if those are exposed as APIs by the third-party system.
So the flexibility is there for whatever end state you want. You can just kind of code it into that plugin.
Yes.
Some assembly required.
Correct. How is this different than just-in-time provisioning? So let me first clarify between inbound and outbound provisioning. So when a user is getting created in Salesforce, that's the inbound provisioning. You can create it using the Scheme API that Pat demonstrated. You can use the Salesforce user API, or you can use the SAML just-in-time provisioning, where when a user tries to log in into Salesforce and the user account is not present, then the account is created on the fly. Now, user provisioning is mostly catering to the outbound provisioning, which is once a user is in Salesforce, how do I create, update user in third-party systems? Again, that can be done in two ways, using this feature, user provisioning, or using the SAML just in time for the outbound. When I try to go to Google, and if they support a SAML just in time provisioning, then I could use that to automatically provision the user. But this one is more around using the APIs, creating and updating users.
Right, and of course, deprovisioning is something that you can't do just in time, that you have to actually send a message to say deactivate or remove this user.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because when SAML just in time always makes use of the user logging in, and if the user is deactivated, then it's an offline,
log in.
out of band operation.
Right.
Okay.
Do we have time for, how many questions do we have time for? A couple more? Okay. Okay, so
how does it delete or deactivate user if they are linked to leads or other items that have to be reassigned? Now, if you have multiple logs and you want to deactivate a user in a second org, then and if the user is part of a particular approval process or workflow, let's say, then they cannot be deactivated. In that case, your plugin should be freezing the user. So there is an API to freeze the user, after which the user cannot access any data on the org. So that's the alternate to deactivate.
Okay, so freezing is like one step short of deactivation. They're kind of still there, but they can't log in anymore.
Yeah, and all their current sessions get killed immediately.
Right. Are they still using a license?
They still use the license, but they cannot log in.
Okay.
That's the difference between deactivate and freeze.
It could be an intermediate step on the way to deactivation then.
Yeah. So right. The administrator can clean up the process to deactivate and then finally deactivate the user.
Okay, so one more question. Let's make it a good one. What have we got here?
Okay. How much does it cost?
Oh yeah, that's the $64,000 question.
So this is a feature that's part of the Salesforce Identity. Now, Salesforce Identity itself is included for free with every Salesforce user license. So if you have a CRM license or Service Cloud license, then Identity is included, and this feature user provisioning is included with it. Now, if you have users who have no Salesforce license, then they can get a standalone identity license from Salesforce. For the employees, there is a Salesforce identity license. For the customers and partners, there is an external identity license. So talk to your account executive and they can help you navigate with, based on your user needs, what you need.
And the standard non-profit discounts would apply in that case because they're just licenses.
That's correct.
Excellent. Thank you for tuning in to today's webinar on user provisioning, and we'll hope to see you again next week for Apex testing. Thank you very much.